On the morning of the 1st of September 1939, the illusion of peace collapsed with brutal speed. German forces crossed the Polish border under the thunder of artillery and the howl of aircraft engines. For the Polish Air Force, the war began not with confidence, but with grim realism. Their pilots were skilled, disciplined, and courageous, but they were being sent into the sky with machines already made obsolete by time. Mirosław Ferić stood among them, gathered on a field near Warsaw, listening to his commander speak of duty and resolve. The man addressing the pilots was Zdzisław Krasnodębski, known simply as the King. His words carried the weight of history and the burden of truth. Poland would fight, and it would fight alone. The imbalance was immediate and unforgiving. Polish pilots flew PZLP, 11 sea fighters nimble and well-handled, but hopelessly outdated against waves of German bombers escorted by modern Messerschmitt fighters. Speed, firepower, and numbers all favored the Luftwaffe. What the Poles lacked in technology, they tried to compensate for with discipline and sheer flying skill. In the opening days, they achieved small but meaningful successes. A handful of German aircraft fell from the sky, driven off by aggressive maneuvering and fearless attacks. Yet each victory came at a staggering cost. Losses mounted rapidly. Aircraft returned riddled with holes or did not return at all. By the third day, the reality was impossible to ignore. This was not a contest Poland could win from the air. Ferić learned that lesson firsthand. During a desperate engagement, his fighter was caught at the worst possible moment mid-turn, exposed, slow. Cannon fire tore into the fuselage. The control stick was shot away from his hands. With no authority over the aircraft, he spiraled downward, pinned to his seat by crushing forces, watching the forest below rush up to meet him. There was no heroism in that fall, only helplessness. At the last moment, the shattered aircraft broke apart and threw him clear. His parachute opened just in time. He survived, not because of skill, but because fate briefly relented. When he reached the ground, injured but alive, the meaning of the situation became painfully clear. The squadron was being destroyed. Within days, it was reduced to a fraction of its former strength. 8 enemy aircraft destroyed. 36 Polish machines lost. The Luftwaffe now roamed the skies almost unchallenged. The order soon came that no pilot wanted to hear. Poland could no longer afford to lose what little remained of its airmen. They were to withdraw to escape not as deserters, but as survivors. Led by Krasnodębski, the remnants of the unit fled toward Romania, carrying with them the bitter knowledge that their homeland was being consumed behind them. For Ferić, the war did not end there. It simply changed shape. Stripped of a country, uncertain of the future, he began to write. In a small diary, he recorded names, moments, and emotions, aware that if they did not survive, memory itself might be the final casualty. Exile is not simply the absence of home. It is the slow erosion of identity. For the Polish pilots who escaped the fall of their country, survival brought neither relief nor honor. Instead, it delivered uncertainty, suspicion, and a humiliating pause in a war that still burned within them. From Romania, they were pushed onward, country after country, until Britain became their final refuge. There, they expected to fight again. What they found instead were barracks, paperwork, and waiting. The men who had flown against impossible odds over Poland were suddenly grounded, treated not as veterans, but as a problem to be managed. Rumors followed them closely. Poland had fallen in weeks. Its army was crushed, its air force obsolete. Among British officers, a quiet assumption took hold. Polish pilots were reckless, undisciplined, and unfit for modern air combat. Skill, it seemed, was measured not by experience, but by nationality. The tension crystallized with the arrival of their RAF commander, Ronald Kellett. Well-connected, confident, and enthusiastic, Kellett had volunteered eagerly, but he had never faced an enemy in the air. To him, the Polish pilots were an unknown quantity, and caution quickly turned into condescension. They were ordered to relearn basic procedures, study the imperial measurement system, and attend English lessons, delays that felt insulting to men who had already bled for the war. Resentment grew on both sides. The Poles saw wasted time while Britain burned. The British saw defiance where they expected compliance. Arguments simmered just beneath the surface, threatening to fracture the unit before it ever took flight. Amid this strain, one man kept the squadron together. Zdzisław Krasnodębski understood what was at stake. He absorbed frustrations, mediated disputes, and quietly pressed RAF leadership to accelerate training. His authority was not enforced through rank alone, but through trust. To the Polish pilots, he was more than a commander. He was the last symbol of a military tradition that exile could not erase. During these weeks of enforced inactivity, Mirosław Ferić returned to his diary. What began as a personal record became a collective act of resistance. He encouraged other pilots to write, to document their thoughts, their doubts, and their determination. If they were not allowed to fight, they would at least preserve the truth of who they were. Eventually, the decision came. The Poles would form their own unit within the RAF. No, 303 Squadron RAF. It was not trust, not yet, but it was an opening. New aircraft awaited them, modern fighters, Hawker Hurricanes. For the first time since leaving Poland, the men felt the ground shift beneath their feet. They were still watched, still doubted, but now they were finally being given the one thing that mattered. A chance to prove themselves in the sky. The Hawker Hurricane was not a miracle machine. It did not outclass every German fighter, nor did it promise easy victories. But to the Polish pilots of the newly formed 303 Squadron, it represented something far more important: parity. For the first time since the war began, they were climbing into cockpits that did not betray them before the fight even started. Training moved quickly, almost too quickly. The Poles absorbed new procedures with impatience, thinly disguised as discipline. They already knew how to fight. What they needed was permission. That permission did not come easily. On August 30th, the squadron was airborne on a training mission, rehearsing attacks on bombers. Mirosław Ferić flew with focused restraint, feeling the familiar rhythm return to his hands and feet. Then the order came from Ronald Kellett: return to base. Enemy aircraft were approaching, but the squadron was not yet cleared for combat. For the Poles, the command landed like an insult. Britain was under attack, bombers were inbound, and they were being told to turn away. One pilot did not. Ludwik Paszkiewicz had reached the limit of his patience. Breaking formation, he pushed the throttle forward and surged ahead alone. Within moments, he spotted a German fighter diving after a hurricane below. Paszkiewicz did not hesitate. He rolled in behind the enemy and fired from close range. The result was immediate and unmistakable. The German aircraft erupted in flames, twisted violently, and slammed into the ground. The kill was clean, undeniable. Back at Northolt, uncertainty hung in the air. Had Paszkiewicz been shot down? Had he disobeyed orders for nothing? Then the sound reached them: a single Hurricane engine, approaching fast and low. Pilots spilled out of the barracks just in time to see Paszkiewicz roar over the treetops and roll triumphantly above the airfield. Cheers erupted. For a brief moment, pride drowned out protocol. The reckoning came swiftly. A furious British officer marched through the crowd and ordered Paszkiewicz to report immediately. The reprimand was severe, the language sharp, rules had been broken, authority challenged. But the damage to doubt had already been done. When Paszkiewicz returned, his mood was unbroken. He sought out Ferić and asked for the diary. Inside, he wrote a single line, simple and almost childlike: "I have fired at an enemy aircraft for the first time in my life." The words carried more weight than any official report. That night, the squadron celebrated. Even the famously reserved Paszkiewicz drank too much. Laughter replaced resentment. And before the night was over, Kellett delivered the news that mattered most. The 303 Squadron was now fully operational. The following day, they would fly not as students or observers, but as combat pilots of the Royal Air Force. For the Polish airmen, it was not merely an assignment, it was vindication. The sky had finally become a place where truth could no longer be ignored. Combat came swiftly, without ceremony. On the afternoon scramble, engines ignited across Northolt with mechanical urgency. Within minutes, the Hurricanes of 303 Squadron were climbing hard, pulling into formation as the sky ahead darkened with incoming enemy aircraft. This was no longer theory. London lay beneath them. Failure was not an option. The first engagement unfolded with shocking speed. German bombers approached under fighter escort, confident in their numerical advantage. Leading the formation, Ronald Kellett drove the first three Hurricanes directly into the enemy, using the sun to mask their approach. The effect was devastating. In seconds, 3 German fighters were torn apart, burning wreckage spiraling toward the earth. What followed revealed the fatal mistake of the Luftwaffe. As German pilots gave chase to Kellett's group, they exposed their flanks. Behind them waited the remaining Polish pilots' men who had learned the hard way what hesitation cost. Mirosław Ferić pushed his Hurricane forward and selected a target. The German pilot broke off his attack and turned to evade, committing fully to the duel. The two aircraft twisted through the sky, trading altitude and speed in a deadly spiral. Feric stayed with him, closing the distance with calculated precision. Later, he would describe the moment with quiet astonishment. "I was surprised and puzzled at the ease of it," he wrote. Their fuselage filled the entire diameter of the luminous ring. The result was immediate and wonderful. The enemy aircraft disintegrated under concentrated fire, falling away in flames. Within a single hour, the 303 Squadron claimed 6 confirmed victories without losing a single aircraft. The result was undeniable. Skepticism evaporated as burning Messerschmitts marked the sky. The animosity of the previous weeks vanished with them. From that day forward, the squadron flew relentlessly. Whenever weather allowed, they were in the air intercepting bombers, engaging escorts, pressing attacks with aggressive confidence. Kellett, once cautious and distant, adapted quickly. After scoring his own victory, he no longer led with doubt, but with trust. The true test arrived on the 15th of September 1940. In a final, desperate effort to crush British air defenses, the Luftwaffe launched its largest assault yet. Hundreds of aircraft crossed the channel in what would become the decisive day of the Battle of Britain. The sky became chaos. Fighter formations dissolved into massive, swirling melees. Tracer fire stitched the air from every direction. Aircraft collided, broke apart, or vanished into smoke. Parachutes blossomed everywhere as pilots bailed out amid falling debris. The Polish pilots threw themselves into the fight with ferocity shaped by loss and exile. They closed to point-blank range, firing with devastating effect. Wings were sheared away, fuselages split open. The air was filled with fire, metal, and noise. By the end of the day, the attack had failed. Britain still stood. The 303 Squadron was battered but victorious, credited with 16 enemy aircraft destroyed. One pilot was lost, a reminder that even triumph demanded payment. Statistics later confirmed what eyewitnesses already knew. Among all RAF units, 303 Squadron was one of the most effective. But in the moment, numbers mattered less than the truth now written across the sky. The Polish pilots had not merely defended Britain, they had rewritten their place in the war. The Battle of Britain has often been remembered as a purely British triumph, a story of radar stations, airfields, and a nation standing alone. Yet that narrative, while powerful, is incomplete. Woven into its outcome were the contributions of men who had already lost everything. The Polish pilots of 303 Squadron were not defending abstractions. They were defending an idea of freedom that had failed them once and could not be allowed to fail again. From a strategic perspective, their impact was undeniable. In an air campaign where margins were thin and attrition decided outcomes, efficiency mattered. Later analysis would show that no 303 Squadron RAF achieved one of the highest kill-to-loss ratios of any unit engaged in the campaign. Conservative post-war research credits them with more than 58 confirmed victories, still placing them among the most effective squadrons in the entire Battle of Britain. For American observers, both then and now, the lesson runs deeper than numbers. The survival of Britain in 1940 reshaped the trajectory of the war. Without secure British airspace, there would have been no strategic base for the later Allied return to Europe, no Normandy landings, no sustained bombing campaign, no Western Front as it came to be known. Long before the United States formally entered the conflict, the outcome of the Battle of Britain quietly shaped America's future role in the war. The Polish experience offered another, more uncomfortable lesson, one about alliances themselves. These pilots arrived with combat experience paid for in blood, yet they were initially dismissed due to prejudice, politics, and assumptions of inferiority. Their story serves as a reminder that coalitions succeed not through hierarchy alone, but through trust and the willingness to recognize hard-earned competence, regardless of origin. For Mirosław Ferić, the war was never just a sequence of missions, it was a responsibility to remember. Throughout the campaign, he continued writing, documenting victories, losses, and fleeting moments of humanity amid violence. In one entry, he explained his purpose with quiet clarity. He was preserving what might otherwise be forgotten, the daily courage of men who had no certainty of survival. That responsibility outlived him. In February 1942, long after the skies over Britain had grown quieter, Feric was killed in a flying accident. His Spitfire's wing failed mid-air, sending the aircraft into a fatal spin near the very base he had once called home. He did not die in combat. There was no enemy in sight. Yet his loss struck deeply. For the men of the squadron, It felt like losing the voice that had given meaning to their struggle. They chose not to let that voice fade. The diary continued. Page after page was added accounts of missions, reflections on fallen friends, names carefully recorded so they would not vanish into statistics. By the end of the war, it had grown into 7 volumes, thousands of pages long. Today, it rests in the Polish Institute and Sikorsky Museum in London, not as a relic of victory, but as a testament to memory. Post-war history dealt harshly with many of the men who had defended Britain's skies. Poland emerged from the conflict not liberated, but absorbed into the Soviet sphere the very power that had once collaborated in its destruction. For years, many Polish veterans remained in exile, unable or unwilling to return to a homeland that no longer resembled the one they had fought for. Yet history did not end there. Some lived long enough to see Poland reclaim its independence. Others found new lives across the West, carrying with them memories shaped by fire, loss, and unacknowledged service. Their legacy is not defined by borders restored or medals awarded, but by the undeniable truth that when history demanded sacrifice, they answered without guarantees, without applause, and often without reward. So what are we left with today? Not just the story of a squadron, not just the record of an ace, but a question that still matters. How do we measure contribution in moments when survival itself hangs in the balance? And how many stories remain unheard simply because they belong to those who arrived as outsiders? If this history resonates with you, if you believe the lessons of courage, alliance, and remembrance still matter, share your thoughts below. Which part of this story stayed with you the most? And if you value preserving the human side of military history, consider subscribing. The battles may be over, but the responsibility to remember them is not.